the more people are worried about strategic challenges, that's a sign of the dangerous world we're in.
You're listening to the USSC Briefing Room, a podcast from the United States Study Center at the University of Sydney, where we give you a seat at the table for a USSC briefing on the latest developments in U.S. news and foreign policy. We'll cover what you need to know and what's beneath the surface of the news. Hello, I'm Mari Kirk, Director of Engagement Impact at the United States Study Center. Thank you for joining us on the USSC Briefing Room today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're recording on today. The University of Sydney is located on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and future. When talking about AUKUS, a majority of Australians think it's a good idea for Australia to have nuclear-powered submarines, but much of the public debate is around cost and whether it is worth the money. One of the most significant aspects of AUKUS is the fact that the United States is agreeing to share some of its most sensitive nuclear technology with Australia. But this requires not just a strong foundation of trust between the two countries, but a regulatory and industrial ecosystem to support it. What do Australia, the UK, and the United States get out of the technology transfer in AUKUS? What changes are needed in the defense industrial base to support this? What are the biggest challenges facing defense industrial cooperation and integration between the US and Australia? To discuss these questions, I'm happy to welcome Cynthia Cook on the USSC Briefing Room. Cynthia is the director of the Defense Industrial Initiatives Group and a senior fellow in the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. She is widely published on defense acquisition policy and technology development, and she recently visited Australia to participate in USSC's GUIO and NextGen activities. Welcome to the podcast, Cynthia.
Thank you. I'm joining from Washington, D.C., and I'll highlight that I am on the ancestral lands of the Anacostans and the neighboring Piscataway and Pamunkey peoples. So I appreciate your highlighting the traditional owners of our land.
Oh, lovely. I love hearing that when we have guests joining us from around the world, when we can learn a bit about that history and heritage as well. And at the end of this episode, we're going to get your by-the-numbers stat on this topic. So I look forward to hearing that. Now, you recently visited Australia as a visiting fellow with the USSC, and you covered a lot of ground while you were here. Where did you see either the most interest or concern regarding defense industrial cooperation from the Australian audience?
So, Mari, the visit was terrific. We were talking about the guided weapons and explosive ordnance enterprise. There is considerable interest from Australia industry in participation in that, both for industrial cooperation reasons and also because it's fairly widely recognized that it is in the strong strategic interest of Australia to support the GUIO enterprise. So really considerable interest in working with the U.S. and U.S. industry on munitions and weapons production. So that was really heartening to hear. When we come from the U.S., generally there is interest in working with the U.S. because of our technology and the size of our defense market. But even though it is, I hear it frequently, it is really an honor every time to know how much other nations value our partnership as well. So, and Australia is one of the U.S.'s closest partners. Every time we're in the fight, Australia is with us. So it's always terrific to engage with Australia from that perspective. We can talk about the challenges in a bit, but I just want to highlight that there's interest in defense cooperation, but there is also concern about ensuring that it actually happens. So the U.S. and the Australia have had a number of agreements over the years in support of defense industrial cooperation. For example, most recently, the excitement of AUKUS has been a significant focus, but Australia is also part of the National Technology Industrial Base, and we have other agreements supporting cooperation. That said, cooperation is hard. It's difficult. There are numerous challenges that are both at the policy and regulatory level and also at the corporate level. There are challenges, widely understood and widely known challenges with regard to export controls and ITAR. We know that there is ITAR reform underway, and that was viewed very positively, but there were concerns about the breadth of the accepted technology list. So, one person really said that it was, the ITAR reform was great in concept, but there wasn't, for what they were concerned about, there wasn't a lot of movement in terms of the challenges that they would face. That said, the fact that it is happening at all really was viewed as a positive sign. For ITAR, it is a challenge, but industry also recognizes the importance of avoiding proliferation. So they're very supportive of the goals of that. And they also know that there's a process and a policy, there's a policy and a process and notably a decision at the end. There are other challenges in cooperation where they don't have that sense. For example, documents of no real sensitivity marked as no foreign, concerns about CUI, and other things that over time whittle away at the culture of cooperation and just make it harder for government and industry to take risks. So both at the regulatory level, because of the delays that it causes and the challenges it causes for regulation, but also really at the cultural level of how do we make sure that everybody from, everybody in the ecosystem knows that they have to say yes to cooperation. The concern is that if one person says no and 99 people say yes, that it won't happen. So that needs the support for cooperation does need consistent leadership support to make it happen.
Yeah. And it's a really complicated and challenging thing. One of our USSC research fellows, Tom Corbin, and Bill Greenwald from the American Enterprise Institute have written a couple of reports on the topic of ITAR reform. And one of their big, focus areas was just on how under the regulations, it's like a one-size-fits-all approach to everything. So a screw being treated with the same level of sensitivity as actual weaponry or something. And so they're advocating for just a level of discernment, reasonable discernment between things so that not everything is just getting stamped with the same level of the highest sensitivity. And because that really does slow things down and, jam up the gears of trying to move these things forward.
So their work is very thoughtful, and I would commend it to all your listeners. We, for our visit, for my visit recently, for my visit in August, and also for some work funded by Australia's Strategic Policy Grant Program on defense industrial cooperation, we focused on the challenges of cooperation at the tactical level. So industry is definitely, their big focus is finding a customer that's interested in their work. And it is interesting to hear that the pervasive challenges that industry faces when doing business with the government are really the key considerations and concerns, especially of small businesses. And ITAR underpins that, but again, it is a well understood government policy with a reason. The ITAR reform was welcomed very, very strongly by the people that I talked to, with the caveat about the accepted technologies.
And it's interesting. I mean, there's been a lot of debate around AUKUS in Australia, which makes sense, and it's good to have that public debate. We mostly hear about the technology transfer of from the U.S. to be able to have the capability to have nuclear-powered submarines. So Pillar 1 of AUKUS is a thing that most Australians are quite aware of, which is a huge deal in and of itself. Just transferring that highly, highly sensitive technology is remarkable. But in addition to that, Pillar 2 of AUKUS focuses on facilitating cooperation on a range of different advanced capabilities. And that covers everything, hypersonics and, sensors and quantum, like a whole range of really advanced and emerging and constantly evolving technologies as well. Like when AUKUS was first announced 3 years ago, the initial list for what were the technologies under Pillar 2 was a lot smaller, and then it keeps getting added to, and this. But what sort of changes do you think are needed in the defense industrial ecosystem to be able to deliver on this broader technology sharing and transfer across the AUKUS countries?
So the Pillar 1 has been the focus of significant attention and really, really hard government work. So and there are plans for sailors to be trained, and there is a lot of work underway on Pillar 1. So let's talk about Pillar 2. And the reason I want to focus there is that these technologies align with some of Australian industry's competencies. Australian industry may not be sized to compete in the global market by designing and producing fighter planes, for example. But in terms of advanced subsystems, Australia has a really good high-tech sector, and small and medium-sized enterprises that can really help advance technologies in the areas identified by Pillar 2. So that does represent a really exciting opportunity to engage Australian industry in the broader industrial base. The challenge, of course, is always going to be one of matching intent. AUKUS is great. We need it. We want to work more closely with our allies. And Australia has the same focus as does the UK. So this is something that the three close allies share. The challenge is getting from the policy level to the tactical level of actually developing a requirement, funding the requirement, acquiring a new system, or connecting the company, the innovator, with a larger defense contractor, plugging them into the ecosystem as a key supplier. So those more tactical challenges are the ones that are pervasive in terms of bringing innovation into the defense industrial base. That is not an Australia unique problem. That is more a bigger challenge. And when it was interesting when I talked to, we talked to around 24 Australian companies as part of this SPG project. And one of the consistent challenges that they raise, one of the things that management is focused on, is trying to connect their innovation with customers. And it was particularly interesting to me because I had interviewed a number of U.S. small businesses the previous year, and I had heard exactly the same challenge. They have innovation. It's going to make it could really make a system more effective. The question is, how do you find the funding to, develop and bring that to market? Or if it's developed, how do you match it with a customer? And when we think about the ecosystem more broadly, if the U.S. Department of Defense or the Australian Department of Defense is buying an existing system and there is a new innovation, the question is, what proven supplier are they going to have to get rid of in order to bring the new innovation into the program? So that aligns with the question of how innovation overcomes the valley of death, which is another topic that you and I have chatted about. So how do we think about these big ecosystem questions of getting Australian industry involved in an allied industrial base face unique problems just because of tech transfer issues, ITAR, et cetera. But they also face some of the common problems that all small innovative businesses face, which is really finding their market.
Mm. And so what would you say, maybe this came up in your discussions in Australia, but what kind of levers can be pulled in order to kind of tweak the settings to maybe help overcome the valley of death issues you see in converting innovation into, practical implementable solutions where defense procurement can access that new technology and work together across these areas? Is it government action? Is it do things sit with the the defense industrial sector? Is it in the higher education and research and development sphere? What things can be tweaked and adjusted to help overcome some of those challenges?
Oh, well, I'll start off by saying that in some of the work I've done on emerging tech, the line is drawn between invention and innovation. Oh. Invention is great, but until it's on a system making a difference, it's not true. It's not really an innovation. The question is, how do you have a really great invention sector, and how do you make sure that you're moving appropriate inventions into innovation and crossing the valley of death and getting them either connected with existing systems or, for getting funding for further development. One of the Australian companies that I talked to highlighted a contract they had with DIU, or DoD's Defense Innovation Unit, as indication of what they viewed as a really critical success. Now, that funding did not represent a customer that was going to invite them to produce to scale, but it was a sign that somebody in the U.S. defense industrial ecosystem, especially the innovation ecosystem, found that their work was interesting and important enough to fund or place a bet on. So there are organizations that are focused on that kind of support to innovative small businesses. So, if DoD could provide more funding, if perhaps Australia could fund their own sector. So just really focusing on on this particular slice of the problem. Sometimes small industry needs capital to grow. So things like getting funding from organizations that are involved in the S&T community, like DIU, is all the sign that small businesses, that venture capitalists need to further invest in small business and provide them the capital that they need to grow. So these signal is that the government should understand the signaling role it plays in trying to, bring along or uplift innovation. Government, so competitions to try to get companies to do innovation. Competitions offer companies something to shoot for so that they can focus their efforts, because defining what a government need is sometimes all that companies need to make sure their invention is in the right direction. They need those market signals. And finally, when government does work with small industry, it has to recognize that they're in a very different position than, your Lockheeds, your Boeings, your Northrop Grummons, your General Dynamics, and your RTXs. Those big five contractors have, a different set of challenges than small businesses. For a small business working on, trying to make payroll and trying to communicate with investors, there can be an enormous difference in having a contract signed on, March 25th at the end of a financial quarter, versus April 2nd at the beginning of the next quarter. That difference can that week can be all the difference in the world when they're talking to investors about their market potential. So understanding the business models of small industry is also something that government can do. But really, it's important to send those signals, define what they want, make sure there's funding, and really investments in the innovation ecosystem are really critical. And we do see some of that. And the challenge with investing in innovation is the government, all governments have some limited funds. So the question is always, what are they not going to invest in? So there's always trades. They can't invest, all their money in this one sector because there's other things they need to invest in.
Oh, and one other interesting angle with innovation that we're hearing talked about a bit more here in Australia is if you add other players into the mix that bring different strengths, different capabilities. And you've researched U.S. defense relationships with a range of other allies and partners, including Japan. We're hearing increased discussion of expanding AUKUS Pillar 2 to include Japan. And in our allies and partners poll this year, we found that 53% of Australian respondents said they think that AUKUS should be extended to include Japan. So how would adding another player into the mix on AUKUS Pillar 2, how would that impact the defense industrial ecosystem? What would they add into the mix if they wanted to and then eventually did join up with AUKUS in some way?
Well, Japan does offer tremendous technical strength in terms of emerging technology. They also have industrial strength. They're very robust shipbuilders. They're going to be building F-35s. So they really are an industrial powerhouse, and their industry is definitely larger than Australia's. In terms of their addition to AUKUS, they would bring those capabilities to the partnership. But I would also highlight that, we have close relationships with Canada, with the Republic of Korea. There's other allies and partners out there as well. Japan is the one that I'm hearing the most buzz about in terms of joining AUKUS. So I think that's a really great place to start. The challenge is it's not that there's a particular challenge with the Japan in or out. It's a challenge. The challenge is really the message. The challenge is really the investments in the technologies themselves. One of the frustrations I'm hearing when I talk to industry is that they can't point to particular contracts and say, oh, we have that because it's AUKUS. We have, gotten this contract, or this other country or company has gotten this contract, and we see the roots in the AUKUS agreement, in Pillar 2, in this list of advanced technologies, and that's why we have this work. So I think that really does need to be the focus of how do we take the next steps to make sure that industry sees AUKUS as a foundation of why they are getting work, why investment is happening. So I think that Japan certainly has technical capabilities to add to Pillar 2. The question is making sure that AUKUS as a whole is executing what it is intended to do, or AUKUS Pillar 2. So we would love to see those advanced technologies. Now, AUKUS also has deterrence effect. It shows our adversaries that we're working together with our close partners on advanced technologies. And certainly Japan could add to that because they live in the same world and face the same threats that the rest of us do.
Huh. And in August, you released a report that you co-authored called Building a Mutually Complementary Supply Chain Between Japan and the United States. It talks about Japan's strict limitations that hamper their defense spending and plans to acquire certain capabilities, and then the opportunities to change settings to make a more integrated defense supply chain possible between the two countries. Do you think there'd be much interest by the Japanese in joining AUKUS? And would any changes be needed in their defense approach in order to kind of like pave the way to make that possible?
So I can't speak to the Japanese, Japan's opinion on this. Generally, there's been a change in Japan's perspective and approach to investments in military technology over the past few years, and that is really based on our dangerous world. China has violated their airspace. They've withheld critical materials from them in a famous case of some years ago. So as Japan is grappling with an increasingly dangerous world, they're revisiting some of their traditional policies to see whether they need to be updated to ensure that they are able, that they enhance their readiness and resilience.
And we in our annual poll that we do, we started polling not just the United States and Australia, but also Japanese respondents as well. So it's interesting. We asked the question of whether the AUKUS agreement should be expanded to include Japan. And of the three countries, the Japanese response was the weakest. And it wasn't that they were opposed, but the largest category was don't know. That was a lot. Like 34% of the Japanese response said don't know. So either they're not really aware of it or just are uncertain about it. But there were 29% of the respondents who said that they thought it would be a good idea for Japan to join AUKUS, and then a small proportion who said it would not be. But I think it's just still quite an unknown quantity, and there isn't that strong intent there at this stage.
From my perspective, the fact that specific defense industrial cooperation in agreements aren't widely known or talked about is not a bad thing. That means people think that they're secure. The more people are worried about strategic challenges, that's a sign of the dangerous world we're in. So I wonder what the poll results about joining an agreement 10 years ago would have been. I know AUKUS wasn't around then, but 10, 20 years ago, what would they have said?
Yeah, it would have been a different story. I mean, one of the big changes that we've seen in the poll while we've been asking about Americans about sentiment towards alliances and partnerships is whether they think different alliances make their country safer. And we've seen a huge uptick in the number of Americans who say they think the alliance with Australia makes America safer. So we've seen that go way up. And similarly, there's similar uptick with NATO and other countries as well. So that, the view of the value of alliances seems to be increasing given the geopolitical stage.
Well, we all love Australia. So
yes.
I think there's that as well.
Yes, very much so.
More seriously and more soberly, the value of allies and partners is highlighted in every national security document. Starting from the national security strategy, the national defense strategy, a variety of subsidiary strategies, and I'd highlight that it's one of the 4 key themes of the new national defense industrial strategy. Economic deterrence refers to working with partners and allies. We need you in our supply chains because we can't produce everything. We need you to be buying our stuff. We need to be buying your stuff. All of this increases our ability to interoperate, to fight together, to train together. So these partnerships are part of a bigger strategy that together we're stronger. And showing that we are closely tied and closely aligned is part of our deterrence strategy. So if you fight any of us, you fight all of us. So I think that these, and again, I'm not, and we have Article 5 in NATO. We don't have those same formal agreements with other nations, but so I don't want to speak out of turn here, but it does send a deterrence message that, when you have friends. And we know that other nations understand this too. If we look at the war that has resulted from Russia's illegal attack on Ukraine, the industrial base challenges that Russia had at the beginning of the war have been rectified from them working with their allies and partners too. I mean, they're getting material from North Korea, from Iran. They're certainly getting dual-use material from China, if not systems themselves. There's a vast increase in transshipments from the stands to Russia. So they're working around the sanctions regimes that have been imposed on them, and now they're just producing and hoping NATO and Ukraine's allies just get tired and go away. And China is certainly watching that strategy to see how we might react in a future conflict. So it's having these allies and partners is critically important. It certainly has helped Ukraine maintain its role in the fight this as long as it has. So I'm always out there banging the drum with the message about the importance of defense industrial cooperation. And really, we do need to put our money where our mouth is with regard to that. The U.S. can't just expect to constantly sell systems to allies. We need to have more integrated supply chains so we can benefit from each other's strengths.
And on that sobering note, where do you think, what's next for the U.S. and Australia in terms of defense industrial cooperation? What would you think would be next cab off the rank, or what they need to be focusing on?
So I would say that there's no single next thing. First of all, I haven't talked extensively about Pillar 1 because there are a lot of submarine. There's been a lot of attention put on that, and I'm sure that your podcasts have featured other folks talking about Pillar 1. But one of the reasons why so many people are looking at it, well, one of the reasons is that it's so expensive and it's going to take such a huge investment, but it's also really hard. The U.S. submarine, the nuclear-powered submarine ecosystem has been built up over decades. It includes industry. There's a maintenance component. There's a nuclear component. There's the sailors and submariners who are focused on operating the boats and that's an enormous ecosystem. And it's not just building a submarine. That's hard enough, but it's managing the whole ecosystem. And it's also something that the government needs to be involved in. Australia will need government experts, managing programs, overseeing programs, managing the fleet of nuclear submarines, making sure there's policies to recruit and retain the necessary experts. So it is a big effort. There's also social license issues. So that is going to really take a 360-degree approach to everything that the submarine industrial base is going to need, everything the submarine ecosystem is going to need, and a big focus on that. So that's really number one. I do hope there's a plan underway about making specific investments in Pillar 2 capabilities and announcing them and highlighting them. One of the folks I interviewed was a little bit cynical. They said the government should just select a contract that they've already issued since the AUKUS agreement was signed and say that it's Pillar 2 if it fits. So they're definitely eager to see progress, to see measurable progress towards a goal of the goal is new technology. And, that's the outcome. But along the way, we should hopefully have some good defense industrial cooperation. The Guided Weapons and Explosive Ordnance, or GWEO enterprise, is also really exciting. The U.S. does have constraints in its munitions industrial base. If we are in a conflict in the Indo-Pacific, then it would be helpful to have local production, especially given the tyranny of distance and the likelihood of highly contested logistics. So getting munitions from Australia solves a little bit of those problems. It also would support Australia's own warfighting capability. So that's another exciting area. I will say that I'm really excited about the work that Australia and the U.S. is doing together, even though I recognize that there are enduring challenges.
Okay, well, thanks so much for taking us through this complex and important topic. And before we wrap up, I'd love to get your by the numbers stat. So what do you have for us today?
So I would highlight one of the challenges that we've talked about today, which is that it is hard for our Australian companies to do business directly with the U.S. Department of Defense. One of the solutions that we heard during our research is that Australian industry often sets up U.S. subsidiaries. This does go both ways. There are certainly Australian subsidiaries of the major U.S. prime contractors that I mentioned earlier. So it is a known way of doing business in another country. So 85% of U.S. Department of Defense contracts that have an Australian element, which we'll define as origin of content, vendor headquarters location, or place of performance, goes to U.S. subsidiaries of Australian firms. So we do work with Australia, and the work we do with Australian companies does tend to go through their U.S. subsidiaries. And that 85% number is since FY 12.
Okay, wow. That is fascinating.
Now, that is probably the nerdiest number that you've had for a long time. And that is courtesy of my colleague, Greg Sanders, who does a deep analysis of the U.S. defense contracting data set.
No worries. I love it. And we get nerdy numbers all the time. I think the whole segment is geared to for exactly that sort of statistic.
Are you saying that nerds talk about defense industrial cooperation? Because if so, I resemble that remark.
And just as we wrap up, I'd like to point out a couple of other podcasts that may be of interest to our audience. Our CEO, Dr. Michael Green, is co-host of the Asia Chessboard podcast with Jude Blanchett, the Freeman Chair for China Studies at CSIS. And I'd also recommend checking out the USSC Live podcast series. It runs recordings from our major live events, including our 2024 Election Watch series. You can find these on our website at ussc.edu.au or wherever you get your podcasts. Once again, Cynthia, thank you so much for making the time to join us and talk through this complex topic.